We all know that we live in very uncertain times. There is, a war in Ukraine. Russia invaded my home country. It's kind of part of the problem, but we see lots and lots of other sources of macroeconomic uncertainty. And Valerie mentioned some of them, related to the fiscal stance in advanced economies, but also in emerging and developing economies. So there is a lot of uncertainty. We want to understand how this affects macroeconomic dynamics and what policymakers can do about that. This data from the US, there is a variety of ways you can measure macroeconomic uncertainty. This is just one of them, so-called VIX index, which measures uncertainty in the stock market. And it's very clear when we had the Great Recession, there was a spike in uncertainty. When there was the COVID crisis, we had a spike in uncertainty. Now, the kind of arguments we see typically in policy discussions are very simple. For example, this is a quote from the governor of the Bundesbank, the German central bank, where he talks about, recently about, how inflation creates uncertainty, and this is going to be bad for the economy because people are going to spend less, firms are going to invest less. Here's another quote from the governor of Banque de France, basically making the same point. And it is unusual, I must say, for people in Europe to agree on something. And this will be one example where Germany and France have a very clear take on this, and they all say uncertainty is bad for the economy, and we should do something about this. Now, you would think that, with this kind of agreement, we should have ironclad evidence that uncertainty is indeed very bad for the economy. But you look at what we have as academics for this question, and the evidence we have, frankly, is mostly suggestive. Okay, so in a well-cited review article, Nick Bloom, a kind of a father of this literature, was saying that, we don't really have a causal relationship between uncertainty and various choices made by firms and households. Now, why is this so hard? Well, it is so hard because when we have an increase in uncertainty, so many other things are happening at the same time. Usually it's some type of revolution, a natural disaster, an economic crisis. So we have too many things moving at the same time. And so we have this challenge that the first moment, so kind of the average level of productivity, for example, in the economy is moving at the same time when we have a change in how much uncertainty we have, the second moment. And again, I mentioned the invasion of Ukraine. That's one story. It obviously created a lot of uncertainty, but it also raised prices for so many goods, energy, food, and so on. And so this is an example of first and second moments moving at the same time. Now, it doesn't have to be necessarily a war. It may be, for example, the COVID crisis, where, again, we have a spike in uncertainty, and at the same time, we have a collapse in the stock market. And separating these two things is extremely hard for economists. Because fortunately, economists cannot run experiments on their countries. And so we can have this clear-cut randomized controlled trials where we can have very firm, clear causal evidence that when we somehow raise macroeconomic uncertainty, people, firms are going to change their behavior. Now, what we try to do in my line of work here is to pretend that we are not going to run experiments on countries, and instead run experiments on people. It's going to be a smaller unit of analysis. But an advantage of this approach is that we can create exogenous variation in the beliefs of these people. We can make some people more uncertain or less uncertain and see how they change their behavior. And in this context, I'm going to highlight two experiments. One we did on households in the Eurozone, and another one on firms in New Zealand. And the results are surprisingly clear-cut. They paint a clear picture about how uncertainty is affecting choices of households and firms. For example, you raise uncertainty for households, and households are less likely to buy durable goods. They reduce their purchases of non-durable goods. So it's very clear households have a very negative view of uncertainty. Okay, so it is very bad. It's a similar story for firms. You raise uncertainty of firms, they're going to invest less, they're going to hire fewer people, their sales are going down, they are less likely to open new facilities, they are less likely to do R&D. And so again, we have this very clear evidence that whenever you have uncertainty, causally, it's going to result in less economic activity. So more uncertainty is going to inhibit economic activity. Now, how can you show this? Okay, to make sure everybody is on the same page in this room, I will just outline a few methodological details how we can show this, and we can discuss later what this means for kind of policymakers and also for future research. This kind of research involves several stages. First, you have a preliminary stage where you select a sample of people or firms who are willing to participate in your experiment, and you ask these firms or people to report their expectations, for example, for GDP growth rate. And when you do this, you try to elicit not only their point prediction, but their subjective probability distribution. So think about this as you ask people to give you 3 scenarios for the growth rate of GDP: optimistic, baseline, and pessimistic. And then for each of the scenarios, they give you a number, and then you say, please assign a probability to each of the scenarios. Now, once you do this, and it's going to be thousands and thousands of firms and households, you split this group of people, of subjects, into 2 groups. You flip a coin, and if it tails, it goes to information treatment. If it heads, it's going to be the control group. The control group is not going to be told anything. The information treatment group is going to be provided with publicly available information, something that should help these people or firms to better understand the macroeconomic outlook. And it's a very short intervention. I'll give you some examples how this works exactly. Now, what is key in this research is that these 2 groups, the treatment group and the control group, are identical in all respects. They're going to have the same distribution of age, political preferences, education, gender. Everything is identical. The only difference between these 2 groups is that one group is provided with information and the other one isn't. Now, after you do this, you ask those people again to report their beliefs about the macroeconomy. So again, you ask them, what do you think is going to be the growth rate of GDP? And you try to elicit the first and second moments. Okay, so you ask them for the probability distribution. Now, suppose you see a difference there, which is a good sign. That it means you created this exogenous variation. And then you're going to track these people over time. Okay, and you want to see if they change their behavior, if they consume different amounts, if they have a change in the composition of their consumption baskets, if they have different investments, if they hire or fire more people. Now, what kind of information you can provide here? Obviously, you cannot lie to people. It will be unethical. You should give them only the true facts. And also, ideally, you give them something which is available to everybody, so you don't exclude people in the control group, in principle, from benefiting this information. Let me give you some examples of what we can do to these subjects. Here is an example of the treatment we gave to managers in New Zealand. For example, we tell them, look, the consensus macroeconomic forecast for New Zealand is such and such growth rate of GDP over the next year. That's one type of treatment. This is what we call the first moment treatment. We just tell them, okay, the average forecast is such and such number. The second type of treatment is to inform people about how much uncertainty we have in macroeconomic forecasts. And usually it's very hard to convey uncertainty because most people don't know what is the standard deviation of variance or confidence bands. And kind of one metric we found very useful in conveying uncertainty is to tell them something about the disagreement we see in professional forecasts. Okay, so you give them a range and you tell them this range is unusually high, and so this is an uncertain time. And again, this is publicly available information. You can download it from the website of the central bank, or you can read this in newspapers. We're not hiding anything from anybody. We can also do an interaction of these 2 treatments. Tell them about the first moment and the second moment and see if there is any kind of amplification or dampening of providing this information to households and firms. Now, let me give you a sense of how much reaction we have among managers in response to this information treatment. So you would think that, if everybody is rational, these managers are highly informed individuals, this kind of information should be no news to them whatsoever. They should know about this. And so we should see no reaction. In fact, we'll see a very strong reaction to this information. But before I show you the effects of these treatments, let me focus first on the control group. Remember, these guys did not receive any information, and so they have no reasons to change their beliefs before kind of the treatment stage and after the treatment stage. And this figure here shows a bin scatter plot, which is kind of a summary of the data in a non-parametric way. So each of these dots represents roughly an average for 100 firms. So it kind of helps to reduce noise in the data. And what you should see in this bin scatter is that the relationship between prior beliefs and posterior beliefs is very close to the 45-degree line. So these guys don't really have reasons to change their beliefs, and they do not change their beliefs. So this is kind of a sanity test for us that, this experiment is working for the control group. Somebody who should not be responding is not responding. Now, what happens in the first treatment group? Remember, this is the treatment where we tell people about the consensus forecast for the economy in New Zealand. And what you see here is a rotation in the distribution of posterior beliefs. Okay, so for example, you take a person here who is unusually optimistic about the growth rate of GDP, and you tell this person, you shouldn't be that optimistic because the consensus forecast from professional forecasters is 4 percentage points. If this person is rational, he will say, okay, so I had my belief, my prior, I'm given an extra bit of information. If this information is useful, my posterior belief should be an average of what I thought before and the signal I have received. And depending on the strength of the signal, I'm going to assign more weight to the signal or less weight to the signal. The fact that this rotation is so big tells us that people treat this signal as extremely useful, very, very credible. Likewise, if you look at the person here who had an unusually pessimistic forecast, you tell this person, look, you shouldn't be that pessimistic. You're going to, according to professional forecasters, a stronger growth rate of GDP, and this person is going to revise his or her beliefs up. Okay? So this rotation, this change is telling us that these information treatments are very powerful in changing the beliefs of people. And we created this exogenous variation, remember, because the people in the control group, in the treatment group, are identical in all respects but one, that people in the control group don't receive information, people in the treatment group got this, couple sentences of information. This is what happens if you tell people about disagreement among professional forecasters. So you kind of tell them the range is, say, 3%, but you don't tell them if it's from 0 to 3 or 3 to 6 or 6 to 9. So they don't know where the central tendency is. And so the response of initial beliefs is going to be somewhat smaller, but there is still some reaction. People find these scenarios, these ranges useful, and so they kind of potentially eliminate extreme scenarios for the growth rate of GDP. This is what you get if you have a double treatment. You tell them about the first moment and the second moment. And, in a nutshell, you don't see a lot of interaction effects. It's basically as strong as just telling people about the consensus forecast. Now, the main kind of result in this figure, what I want you to get from this, is that providing people with publicly available information is going to have tremendous effect on their beliefs, on their point predictions, and also on how much macroeconomic uncertainty they're going to have. Now, the reason why it's useful is because once you create this exogenous variation in beliefs, somebody becomes more uncertain. Like these people, they started here, we'll move them here. Some people are going to be here, we're going to reduce uncertainty for them. Now, so once we create this exogenous variation with some econometric tricks, we can run a regression and see what is the relationship between various choices these managers made in response to these changes in beliefs. Okay? So here, this result here says that you increase uncertainty measured in a particular way by 1 unit, which is a reasonably sized increase in uncertainty. Firms are going to cut prices by 0.1%. This number here says that you raise uncertainty by 1 unit, and firms are going to cut their employment by 0.6%. You also see that firms are more likely to reduce their capital stock, but wages are not really moving in response, which is making a lot of sense because wages are extremely sticky. You can look at other outcome variables. R&D, not much is changing. Firms become a little bit more profitable. They raise their advertisement budgets because they think they can't sell a lot of stuff, the economy is doing poorly. And so it makes sense that, they cut prices and increase advertisement budgets. Now, I don't have time to go over other outcomes, but in the nutshell, what this experiment shows for firms is that you raise uncertainty, macroeconomic uncertainty for firms, And they're going to have a very dark view of this. They're going to reduce employment, they're going to cut capital, they're going to have smaller sales, they are less likely to open branches. So it's very, very contractionary. You can do the same exercise for households, and we did this in the Eurozone. So you'll have people from Germany, from Italy, from Spain, from France, and you roughly see the same results. You raise exogenously, you create this exogenous variation and uncertainty, and it is going to make purchases smaller for those people, not just non-durable goods, but also durable goods. People are less likely to buy cars, houses, they are less likely to buy luxury items, they are less likely to go on a vacation or something like that. Now, is this a big result? Yes, it is a big result. In our very simple treatment in New Zealand for a relatively small sample of firms, it's only 4,000 firms. For the treated firms, we reduced uncertainty on average, and as a result of this reduced uncertainty, these firms increased their employment by 2.5%. So imagine just academics telling people about managers, about macroeconomic forecast, and from this very simple intervention, we generate kind of a mini boom for these firms. Okay, and we are nobody. We are not really a central bank or Ministry of Finance or anything like this, and people listen to us and they change their behavior in a significant way. Let's skip this. How plausible this response is, right? So, usually it's very hard to evaluate the plausibility because you need to have lots and lots of replication studies. So somebody after us should do this in Korea or in Japan or in the US, do this again in New Zealand or Eurozone countries and see if they can reproduce what we did. We don't have this luxury yet. This service, these experiments are expensive. But what we can do, we can ask managers and firms to ask them, how would you change your behavior if we make you more uncertain about the aggregate state of the economy? A bunch of hypothetical questions. And what we see is that what they report in these hypothetical questions, like, if we increase your uncertainty, would you invest more, would you invest less? Those kind of questions. We see a lot of consistency between their responses to these hypothetical questions and changes in their actual behavior. So if they say we're going to cut employment in a hypothetical question, that's what we also see in their actual choices. So in this sense, it's a confirmation that what we find in these experiments is not just some random stuff going on. It is something reasonable and consistent with reality. One story why macroeconomic uncertainty may be important is because when I'm telling you that you should be more uncertain because about the outlook for, say, the Korean economy, you will say, well, it only affects me because it affects my individual earnings going forward. So it's kind of one explanation how this can work. And there is a way to test if this is really true in the data. And the answer is it's not just this micro channel. People, when they become more uncertain about the macroeconomy, they are so uncertain about so many other things. They are uncertain about the stock market, they're uncertain about employment prospects, they're uncertain about asset prices, so lots and lots of things, interest rates, lots of things are moving at the same time. And that's why we have those huge effects of macroeconomic uncertainty on consumption choices, on investment choices. Do all firms or households respond in the same way? There is some heterogeneity along, for example, firm size or how much education these managers have. There is some variation there. But by and large, almost all firms, all households have a very negative view of macroeconomic uncertainty. Okay, so they don't like macroeconomic uncertainty. It's bad for business, it's bad for consumption, it's bad for investment, it's bad for everything. What does this mean for policy? Now, when you go back to these quotes I gave you from the Bundesbank or Banque de France or Council of Economic Advisors or the Fed, you often see that, when people talk about uncertainty, they always have caveats. They say, if this is true, something should happen. Right? We don't know if it's true, but, we think this is what is happening. Now, this experiment suggests that we don't need to have these caveats. It's a very clear causal relationship between macroeconomic uncertainty and choices made by firms and households. So we should be pretty clear that macroeconomic uncertainty can significantly hurt the economy. What we can do as policymakers? Well, I told you simple academics, when we did this experiment, we created a small boom in the economy in New Zealand. Now imagine if this information came not from us, but from somebody who is more credible, position of power, somebody from the government. This will be much, much more effective in stimulating employment in this country. And it's not just 2% or 2.5%, maybe much higher. Maybe it will be a bigger size of firms. Now, so what this means is that we have a huge potential here for improving our policy communication to control how much uncertainty, macroeconomic uncertainty, businesses and households have. And I guess one useful example to keep in mind when you think about these issues is the famous phrase from Mario Draghi during the global financial crisis. The European bond market was going crazy. Lots of countries were suffering. One of them was Greece. And there was a real question whether the euro is going to survive this. And then Mario Draghi comes along and he says, we'll do whatever it takes to save the euro. And this was extremely effective in reducing macroeconomic uncertainty because they knew that the ECB, the European Central Bank, is going to do everything in their powers to make sure that the euro is not going to implode, that the bond market is not going to explode. So everything is going to be under control. Now, this is a recent example. If you're interested in history, you can go further back in time and, for example, look at how President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was trying to control uncertainty during the Great Depression. He was saying the only thing we have to fear is the fear itself. And so he was extremely effective using his radio addresses to the general public, so-called fireside chats, kind of an olden version of Twitter, when you try to reach out to huge masses of people. He was saying, you have nothing to worry about. The US government is going to be behind you, and we're going to have good times going forward. So when we have this macroeconomic uncertainty today, it seems the world is falling apart. But this is not the first time we have a crisis. And I think it is very important to have leadership here and assure the general public that we can have some bad outcomes, we can have some bad scenarios, but you should know that we, the government, are going to contain this crisis and everything is going to be okay because we have certainly lots and lots of tools to deliver this result.